Hi, I'm Caleb Cain, and you're watching Cain Course World History. Our topic today is decolonization, a word we've thrown around quite a bit, but that basically references to the efforts of the world to get rid of colonies, especially Western involvement in third world areas after World War I and II. And we're going to see a lot of different parts that have to do with this, specifically the fact that these new countries are pushing for independence and complete and total independence. So we're going to see nationalist movements in both Asia and Africa. We'll talk more about that. We will also see that after World War II, a lot of different countries have to negotiate their independence. Some of them have to fight for it. Some of it have to go through more of a diplomatic process, and others are very religiously and ethnically motivated in all of this, right? We've talked about this throughout the entire school year, but countries don't like being governed by people that aren't them or believe something different from them. And there's a lot of examples of this, and it's going to take a while to kind of get through all of those, but we're going to start with probably one of the bigger ones, and that's India. Now, if you look at this map here, it's very clear that India is one of the larger colonies that Great Britain has, even after World War I and II. And Great Britain wasn't really ready to get rid of that because India had produced for a really long time large stores of cotton, which India had allowed Great Britain then to build factories and industrialism. If you remember, Unit 6 was all about that. And you still see a lot of British influence around the world. But as the UN emerges and the end of World War II is more and more apparent, Indians are pushing for their independence. And especially after World War I, we start to see this with the formation of the Indian National Congress, Indians who wanted to govern themselves. Now, most of these Indians were, in fact, Hindu, as that's the most popular religion throughout all of India. However, there were many who were Muslim, going back to the reign of the Mughal dynasty and the expansion of all the caliphates that we've talked about endlessly throughout earlier in the school year, which is why the Muslim League emerged as well. And the Muslim League wanted an independent Muslim state, while the Indian National Congress wanted an independent Hindu state. And as we look at all of these things unfolding, there's kind of a question about, well, what's going to happen to India if they are granted independence? And it's a long road to independence. It starts initially after World War I, when a group of British soldiers massacre a bunch of Indian nationals at what's called the Amritsar massacre. And after that, we start to see the movements of Gandhi, who we've discussed at length already, who was very peaceful and pacifist, nonviolent protest, trying to make India independent. And finally, in 1935, just before World War II, India gets itself governance. And you can see that celebration going on there. Their first prime minister is this guy, Jawaharlal Nehru, who is very successful in creating an independent Indian state that governs itself. No British involvement, no Western involvement. It is self-governing. However, if you look at the map, you might notice something a little bit different. What was India is much smaller now. And part of that is because of the green states that have now emerged, which is Pakistan. Those are the states that are governed by the Muslim League. It was negotiated within that new system created by the Indian National Congress that there would be an independent Muslim state. And ironically, they put it on two sides of India, which is kind of a weird way to go about things. It was deemed to be equal in that way. And however, if you weren't Muslim, you had to live in India. And if you weren't Hindu, you had to live in Pakistan. So there's a lot of displacement of people that go on during this time. And there's actually a lot of violence and a lot of unnecessary death that results in this. But regardless, India is now one of the first examples of independence that we see in the decolonization era after World War I and II. The next best example where we see the effects of decolonization is definitely in the Middle East. And that goes back to right after World War I, when the League of Nations set up the mandate system, which basically put all of the Middle East under the control of Great Britain and France. And great for the British and the French, not great for the people that were living there. But if you notice on this map, there's one area that was independent. Aside from Iran over here, there's another one that's not listed, and that's Egypt, which had control of all of this over here. Here you can see the Nile River. The Egyptians were promised their independence after World War I. However, they basically asked Great Britain to stay to protect the Suez Canal from foreign interests. And so for the rest of World War I, World War II, Great Britain remained very involved in this region over here. But that changes after World War II, when officially Egypt has its independence and it becomes an independent nationalized state, especially under the reign and the leadership of this guy, Gamal Nasser. I'll move myself a little bit so you can see him better. He's very famous for his nationalist steps to make Egypt not only independent, but try to make it a power in the Middle East. And there's a lot of factors that contribute to that. By 1936, yes, they will be independent, but 1945 is truly the start of Egyptian power. And a lot of that is tied to the Arab League. You can see that on this map here. The Arab League was a number of different nations in the Middle East and Africa who had Middle Eastern descent and Arab descent and connected themselves together with that one identity. And this is all a result of something called Pan-Arabism, trying to unite Arabs across the globe, especially in the Middle East. And a lot of it ties back to the ideas that you saw early Muslim kingdoms trying to create with the caliphates and reestablishing the caliphate. And that's a theme that we still see in the Middle East yet today. And Nasser was very upfront with what he wanted and how he wanted to go about it. And one of the things he was very against was an independent state in Israel. So he actually provided support for the Arabs fighting Israel in the Arab-Israeli War. And that continues when he tries to make Egypt even more independent than it already was by nationalizing oil and nationalizing the Suez Canal, which, again, in a lot of ways, was a lifeline for Great Britain and still the only remaining connection they had in the Middle East. And that creates a spark. And with that, there's UN involvement in the Suez Crisis as Egypt began to blockade Israel, and Israel was threatening to declare war, and the United States wouldn't get involved for a variety of reasons. And luckily, the UN was able to get to a ceasefire, but it just shows you how hotly contested these things are getting in the Middle East, especially for resources, whether it's oil or water access. And Nasser continued to try to make Egypt a power, especially with it in relation to Israel. And we see that with not only the Suez Crisis, but the Six-Day War, in which Egypt preemptively striked Israel and, again, only lasted for 6 days, but it still was a war. And then later on in the 70s with the Yom Kippur War. And out of this, Egypt emerges not only as an independent state, but as one that is a power in regards to the Middle East and a factor moving forward. Now, there are some other examples of decolonization as well. Africa sees a lot of them as well. And I'm only going to highlight one for now, and that's Ghana. When Ghana gains its official independence by about 1960, 1957, it's very different than what we see in these other areas because Kwame Nkrumah, who is the president of Ghana, was very focused on trying to make Ghana a lot like the United States and Great Britain. And so he makes changes that include things like a modern currency and a flag and just overall a lot of modern movements in Ghana. But the major thing and the major reason I bring up Ghana is that Ghana was looking for Pan-Africanism, wanted to unite all of these new African countries under one government ruled by Africans, which was a pretty radical idea. Knowing how big Africa is, it's a lot to pick up on. And unfortunately for Africa, that's never going to actually happen. And, currently there are so many states that are still infighting and problems with that. But it does give Africans an overall sense of unity across the continent that it hasn't had before, because so often it's been ruled by people from the West. Now, in addition to that, kind of a funnier one is actually just north of us in Canada, Quebec, which Canada itself had become an independent state right around the time of World War II. But the people of Quebec have actually been wanting independence for a while now. Now, it's not all people from Quebec, but a lot of individuals do. And a lot of that is that Canada was predominantly a British colony, except Quebec was formerly what was known as New France during the French colonial era. And you may recognize this guy here. This is Charles de Gaulle, who was Prime Minister of France, famed general in World War I. He visited Quebec at one point, and in a speech, he said, "Vive la Quebec," which is very similar to the French slogan of Vive la de France, which means long live France. And a lot of people interpreted that kind of the wrong way, thinking he meant Vive la Quebec, as in let's make Quebec independent and French again. And there's still people who are moving towards that as recently as just a few years ago. Many individuals in Quebec desire independence. And when you look at Quebec, it's huge in comparison to a lot of the other Canadian states. So it kind of makes sense. And obviously, so much of Canada is not very densely populated. But it's just kind of a more funny, interesting one that happens to be close by to us with a lot of current ties. You can see that in that picture there as well. But overall, when we look at decolonization, there's definitely motivations more besides just freedom at stake here. A lot of it has to do with religion. And there's a lot of changes going on worldwide when it comes to religion. Religion is becoming more and more secular. A great example of this is here in the United States. You might have seen this image before or heard of this, but the Scopes trial took place in the United States and was focused on whether or not evolution should be taught in schools. And the court kind of came around and said, yes, it should be. And that radically changed the position of Christianity in the United States. No longer is Christianity the predominant way in which people are viewing the world. People look at things through a much more social Darwinist, secular sense. So the reaction to that is something that we would call Christian fundamentalism. Trying to get back to the Bible, back to the book, and back to how things used to be in the United States. I mean, if you look at some of that propaganda there, pretty vicious from Christians trying to tie this all back to a Christian United States. And it's not just Christianity that goes through this. It happens with Islam as well, as Islamic fundamentalism takes a bigger role as well. And we'll look at one of those examples in a second. But one of the other changes that happens within Christianity is the emergence of Vatican II. This was a new change in the Catholic Church, which basically made the Catholic Church and doctrine and the way they practice a little bit more modern. And with that, you start to see the church kind of bending on some things, but also being more solid in things that it hadn't been to try to bring people back to the Bible. Our last example of decolonization happens to be one example of radical Islam and Islamic fundamentalism, and that's the events that happened in Iran, something that I've referenced to a little bit in class. But to give you a little more detail, Iran was another one of these countries that the United States believed was a domino in the competition with the Soviet Union for who is going to be democratic and who is going to be communist. So with that, the United States was very involved in the formation of Iran. In fact, the first ruler of Iran, the Shah, was kind of strategically picked by the United States. I mean, I referenced it before, but the dirty tricks boys at the CIA definitely had their hands in this. And you can see the relationship there with Eisenhower and the Shah. And the Shah was definitely dedicated to making Iran sort of a modern power. And in a lot of ways, the state in Iran right now with the nuclear side of things can definitely be contributed to the United States. But many people in Iran who were Muslim and traditional Muslim did not necessarily appreciate the involvement of the West, which is why rulers or leaders like the Ayatollah Khomeini became very popular. He was a Muslim imam who talked about bringing back basic Islam, and in doing so, bringing back a Muslim rule with only really Muslims in that state, which is why many students eventually rebelled in the Iranian Revolution of the 1970s and stormed the U.S. Embassy. Now, we all know what came out of that with the Iranian hostage crisis, something that truly took a while for the United States to get away from. With all of that in mind, we now want to move to the Blackboard, where we take an AP skill of the day and put that into use with the facts that we've learned today. Let's go to the Blackboard. Welcome to the Blackboard, where we take our AP skills and combine them with the knowledge that we just discussed and the historical facts that are before us. In this case, we're looking again at decolonization. What we want to do today is compare and contrast the efforts of decolonization and independent states of two states that come out of World War II. In this case, I'm going to choose India and Egypt. Now, there's a variety of other countries you could choose, but India and Egypt are very easy to compare, but they're also very different. So we'll start with are similarities. When it comes to similarities, both of these countries, when they emerge as independent nations, are very religiously motivated. In India, you have the independence of both Hindus and Muslims. In Egypt, obviously, it's very tied to Islam. But both of these countries have that. Now, another similarity that both have is the involvement of Great Britain. These are both formerly British colonies. And with that, Britain was very slow to let both of them go and be independent. And the reason for that is the third similarity, which is resource access. Egypt, obviously, with the Suez Canal and oil. India, on the other hand, with cotton and a lot of other materials as well. We'll start with India, which the first glaring difference is that India is typically a little bit more peaceful. Or you could even say pacifist. Think back to what we talked about with Gandhi and the movements that he had to allow India to be independent from Britain, but without using violence. India also has the double religion factor going on with both Hindus and Muslims, which results in both the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League, two very different politically minded groups that resulted in the third difference, two states, India and Pakistan. And that creates a relocation of people that Egypt just doesn't have. So very different when you look at India compared to Egypt. The major highlight is that India is mostly peaceful, but then it does have that dichotomy of two different religions trying to function and find their independence, not just from Great Britain, but actually from each other. And finally, let's look at Egypt and what Egypt has that's different from India in regards to decolonization. The first is probably just the conflict and the militarism that Egypt displays. In addition to that, Egypt has this combination of communism and Muslim fundamentalism that creates a much more religious state. Yes, religion is a factor in India, but in Egypt, it's definitely at the forefront. And a lot of this, again, is tied to the Suez Canal and Israel. And so much of Israel's existence is a part of Egypt's story as well, and vice versa. Both of them are kind of linked because of the conflict that's going on between them. And the final major one is that Egypt, again, is a part of that Arab League, and that seeking of pan-Arabism is definitely at the forefront of Egyptian prominence. And hopefully by comparing India and Egypt, you can see that the effects of decolonization are wide-reaching worldwide. We've seen so many changes going on within the Cold War, and the world is becoming slightly more independent and more interconnected at the same time, and that's had a lot of changing factors that have gotten us into the world in which we live today. Thanks for watching.